Common Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates. As always, colleagues, remind everyone again, just keep headphones away from your mic so we can protect the hearing of our very valued interpreters. We have two witnesses today. We have Chief Bernard, thanks for joining us. We'll open the floor to you for 5 minutes for an opening statement, then we'll go to Mr. Ducharme. But Chief Bernard, the floor is yours. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, and I do apologize for the inconvenience. I'm not very technical savvy here. Greetings. I am Joanna Bernard, the Assembly of First Nation Regional Chief for New Brunswick. The Assembly of First Nations is a national organization representing First Nations and their elected chiefs across Canada. The AFN's mandate is received from First Nations rights holders through resolutions. It is important to have a clear understanding of who right holders are for work related to policies, frameworks, and strategies. I welcome the opportunity to speak to you on the topic of Indigenous procurement. I must note that First Nations require direct consultation on this matter. Procurement policies at all levels of government need to be inclusive to reflect diversity and equality. The distinct-based approach is required to transform the Indigenous procurement landscape. The federal government needs to fulfill its duty to consult and accommodate First Nations on procurement issues, to effectively review and advance policies. This will help eliminate wasteful and corrupt procurement procedures. Equitable procurement policies have an important role in supporting First Nations economic development and meaningful reconciliation. Procurement policies at all levels of government must be inclusive and distinctions-based, moving away from one-size-fits-all approach. The federal government's 5% target is reflected in the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples Action Plan, which we uphold. However, the 5% is the minimal target. The population of Canada is estimated to be 5% First Nations people. If the government is to close the gap with First Nations and lift communities out of poverty, procurement contracts need to reflect an increase beyond the minimal target. The 5% minimal only maintains the current economic status. When First Nations businesses have the capacity and support to participate in bidding and winning contracts, economic prosperity can be reinvested into communities and help them thrive. In October 2019, the AFN prepared an evergreen report on updates and revisions needed to better support access by First Nations, businesses, and procurement in Canada, and focus on the federal procurement portfolio. The Government of Canada, The Government of Canada in 2016 awarded over 340 contracts for goods and services and construction valued at over $18 billion. However, targeted Indigenous procurements under the procurement strategy for Aboriginal business, as it was known then, only totaled 93.5 million in 2015, representing less than 1% of all federal procurements. Today, the federal government spent approximately $22 billion every year procuring goods and services from businesses across Canada. Still less than 1% of that goes towards Indigenous businesses. Procurement policies must also eliminate the risk of fraudulent players looking for financial gains to protect First Nations' best interests. In 2022 and 2023, the federal government released a report on its progress towards the 5% minimum target. The AFN had concerns with the lack of transparency on business definitions and eligible criteria for the types of business who would qualify as Indigenous. Transparency must be prioritized to maintain trust and uphold legitimate Indigenous businesses. Fair, transparent, and open access to procurement opportunities from the Government of Canada, provincial governments, and private sector is the key priority for First Nations and critical to the economic growth, self-determination, and community well-being. The AFN has been working with partner organizations to establish a First Nations procurement organization known as the FFPO from the rest of my speech, which aims to help First Nations peoples and businesses overcome systemic barriers in accessing federal procurement opportunities. Since the first meeting in December 2023, the FNPO has formed a steering committee, of 6 Indigenous organizations, including the AFN. The AFN has also been supporting the development of Indigenous business definitions led by the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association. It was launched in March 2024 and provides a set of criteria that determines what constitutes an Indigenous business or organizations for the purpose of procurement. An Indigenous business is identified as a business where an Indigenous person has sole responsibilities for making decisions, receives all profits, claims all losses, assumes all risks, and pays personal income tax for the Indigenous sole proprietor, and is 100% owned by Indigenous peoples. Cooperation, partnership, nonprofit, and non-for-profit corporations, charitable organizations, and joint venture definitions will include at least 51% of the business structure is owned or controlled by Indigenous people. There is currently no consistent way of verifying the legitimacy of Indigenous businesses, which creates a risk of false claims, tokenism, exploitation by bad actors. The Indigenous business definitions aim to provide clarity and structure to the procurement processes and to prevent the erosion of trust and respect between Indigenous and non-Indigenous partners. The AFN calls for increased transparency, accountability, and support in the government's procurement processes, particularly those impacting First Nations businesses. The AFN will continue to advocate for necessary changes in procurement policies and practices, while also advocating programs and initiatives designed to enhance the capacity of First Nation businesses. Increasing First Nation opportunities.
Sorry, Chief Bernard, we're past our time. Can I ask you to just summarize and wrap up, please?
And okay, I got 2 little quotes here.
Perfect.
And to win, federal contracts should not be impeded by by government's lack of proper First Nation citizenship programs or anti-imposter protections. The process for recognizing First Nations identity, whether by individuals, businesses, or organizations claiming to seek to insert First Nations identity, must be led by First Nations to ensure legitimacy. I want to thank everybody for giving me this time, and this is not the first time I've been working on this since 1999, when the first procurement came out, and we've had issues for the last, I think, according to the standing committee back in 2006, where my brother John Bernard from Donnacona spoke on this, and I'm not sure if everybody at the table has this information from that standing committee, which would help moving the committee forward and making the best decision possible. Another thing before I finish, I do want.
Donc, j'aimerais dire encore qu'il faut arrêter de préparer des documents à 8 kilos et des politiques et de nous les lancer et de dire voici comment il faut passer. Vous perdez notre temps, le vôtre et de l'argent. Donc, il est important que nous puissions commencer ces occasions d'approvisionnement pour les Premières Nations pour que les gens puissent travailler ensemble avec vous pour que nous puissions économiser de l'argent et du temps. Parce que sinon, ça fait beaucoup trop longtemps que cela persiste. Merci. Merci beaucoup. Il nous faut nous arrêter.
English, and English is showing on French. Should be fixed now. Wonderful.
Maybe it's because it's messy.
Thanks, Chief Bernard. We're now going to go to Mr. Ducharme, please. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Good morning. As mentioned, my name is Philip Ducharme, and I'm a member of the Manitoba Métis Federation. I am thankful to be here on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. As Vice President of Entrepreneurship and Procurement at Canadian Council for Indigenous Business, or CCIB, I want to thank you, Mr. Chair, and all distinguished members of the committee for the opportunity to provide comment on Indigenous procurement. Earlier this year, CCIB celebrated our 40th anniversary of building bridges between Indigenous and non-Indigenous businesses and the rest of Canada in support of mutual growth, opportunity, and economic reconciliation. We do this through a number of programs and initiatives, including the research that we conduct, which was recently cited to our President and CEO, Tabitha Bull, by the OECD as some of the best on the Indigenous economy. One of our key priorities over the last 8 years has been on Indigenous procurement. In January 2018, CCIB officially launched Supply Change, our trademarked Indigenous procurement program made up of key pillars, including certified Indigenous businesses, Indigenous Procurement Marketplace, and the Indigenous Procurement Champions. The Indigenous Procurement Marketplace, which is an online platform that allows our certified Indigenous businesses and corporate buyers the opportunity to engage and develop relationships while sharing relevant opportunities. There are currently over 1,300 certified Indigenous businesses and 155 Indigenous procurement champions and advocates within the Indigenous Procurement Marketplace. CCIB certified Indigenous businesses are members of CCIB who we certify through an internal audit process to confirm at least 51% Indigenous ownership and control. We require proof of indigeneity. Self-identification is not accepted. In addition to the proof of indigeneity, we require business documents that prove the share ownership and controls meet the threshold of 51% Indigenous ownership and control. Upon yearly renewal, all certified Indigenous businesses are required to attest that ownership and control has not changed. However, if the validity of one of our certified Indigenous businesses is questioned at any time, we confirm the data we have on record to the extent of confirming membership within the community. If we find that a business no longer meets the definition, their certification is revoked. CCIB has long advocated for targets and reporting on Indigenous procurement, and we were pleased to join Minister Anand on August 6, 2021, when she reaffirmed a mandate of 5% of Indigenous procurement and required reporting on a set timeline. Additionally, other levels of government and numerous corporations have publicly disclosed Indigenous procurement targets, including the Yukon Territory with a 15% Indigenous procurement target and the City of Regina with a 20% Indigenous procurement target. These Indigenous procurement policies are instrumental and necessary to rectifying historical injustices and empowering communities that have long been marginalized and intentionally excluded from the economy to the benefit of corporations and every individual in Canada. The policies are not merely about meeting quotas, but are required to foster economic opportunities for Indigenous people and communities. In any policy, there is a potential for individuals to take advantage. Recently, attention has focused too much on those individuals and the negative outcomes they have created. By consistently portraying Indigenous procurement in a negative light or by disproportionately highlighting instances of alleged misuse or failure, a narrative is being created that questions the competence and legitimacy of Indigenous businesses. This narrative is affecting public perception and, I fear, influencing policy decisions. We cannot allow a few bad actors to cause us to move backwards on crucial support mechanisms designed to uplift Indigenous communities. For clarity, Indigenous business success through procurement and that which supports Indigenous prosperity and self-determination largely outweighs the negative reports. Indigenous procurement in line with the 5% target would inject $1.2 billion directly into the Indigenous economy. And if we take ProMetal, a steel manufacturer owned by Pasco First Nation group of companies, as an example, ProMetal works to supply components for armored vehicles, including LAVs, to the Canadian Army. PFN Group's procurement success is in enabling the construction of 46 new homes, expansion of the high school, and the opening of a 12-suite long-term care facility. This is just one example of the impact successful Indigenous procurement can lead to. In closing, We are not blind to instances of identity fraud, and we acknowledge that there are businesses who have taken advantage of policies and that this has resulted in benefits not reaching those for whom they were intended. However, as in any policy, there will be people who will manipulate the system to make it work to their advantage. The wrongdoings of a few should not call into question the need or value of Indigenous procurement. The solution is not to punish those for whom the policy is built, but to strengthen the policy. I would like to thank the committee for the opportunity to contribute to this important topic, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ducharme. We'll start with Mr. Genuis, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and I want to really thank both of our witnesses for their testimony. I want to share with you that people in my constituency are seized with the importance of advancing truth and reconciliation, and as part of that, with promoting and supporting economic development in Indigenous communities. We want to make the system better. We want to do more to promote economic development, and it is in that spirit that we pushed for this study to take place. I also want to highlight that this committee has been studying procurement abuses in general. We've seen serious problems with procurement under this government, and our goal is to strengthen procurement to provide more benefit for Indigenous peoples, for all Canadians, and for taxpayers as well. Now, Minister Hajdu told the INAN committee in March that the federal government's Indigenous contracting program has one objective: to verify Indigenous identity. She said, quote, "The Indigenous Business Directory is to provide assurances to other departments, including Public Services and Procurement Canada, that the people on that list are Indigenous. That is the sole purpose of the list," end of quote. Meanwhile, while she was telling this to a committee, according to Revelations in Global News, her officials were telling applicants that all they had to do to verify Indigenous identity was upload a picture of a bunny. Now, we've all heard the expression, "you had one job." One job, according to the minister, to verify Indigenous identity. And then all you had to do to verify Indigenous identity was to upload a picture of a bunny. This committee ordered documents on subcontracting because when you get an Indigenous set-aside and you subcontract work, a certain percentage of those subcontracts are supposed to be to Indigenous companies. Not all, of course, but a certain percentage. And yet across departments, we found that there was no tracking whatsoever of subcontracts. So the minister says that the purpose of this program is to verify Indigenous identity, and then spectacularly fails to put systems in place to verify Indigenous identity. And I note that as part of it, that it seems that the qualification of an Indigenous business by this government doesn't line up with the way that Indigenous business organizations and communities are qualifying and defining Indigenous organizations. So I would like to hear from the witnesses what your reaction is to these revelations about an absence of verification of Indigenous businesses, and what can be done to ensure that procurement that is supposed to be for Indigenous businesses is actually for real Indigenous businesses. Maybe we'll go to the chief online first, and then Mr. Ducharme here.
Thank you very much for the question. It's been an issue since the beginning of the program, as you know.
Sorry, I'm going to ask you to hold on 2 seconds. We're barely hearing sound. We're going to turn it up on our end. Can you just give us a couple seconds? Sorry, bear with us one moment. Do you mind starting again, Chief Bernard? We think we can hear you better now.
Okay, how's that? Everything's good? Can you hear me well?
Better, thank you very much. Sorry about that. Please go ahead.
No, thank you very much. Yes, it's very, very important. It's been an issue from the very beginning in regards to this strategy, where there have been token Indians. There's been, sorry to say, you could pick up somebody on the side of the street. If they're Indigenous, they become that token Indian, and there's no qualifications needed for that Indigenous person. So there's some work to be done in that aspect also, ensuring that the Aboriginal is, capable of having the ownership of this so-called business, if it is a shell company, and to make sure that they're there working day to day. And not just being given a couple of dollars on the side just for their name. So this is huge. And in reference to this, our status, we have a status card. Most First Nations, and I think every First Nation does have a status card. When it comes to the Métis, I'm not sure if there is regulations put in place as it is done in the First Nations, where our status is recognized in Canada. And I want to ensure that all the memberships of all of the organizations have something in place to ensure that they are whether Métis or Inuit or First Nations, that there is verification showing that, and not just walking in a door and say, I'm Métis because my great grandfather was, has a descendant. So this is important to us, especially when we're looking at a percentage of 5% for the procurement, when we want to ensure that the First Nation organization does have adequate percentage of that 5% to ensure that we're not just giving a 5% to another organization person whose membership has not been verified by INAC, or does it fall within the terms of that membership. So that's very, very important. And it's been an issue from the very beginning. And I'll give you a perfect example. I owned the brick furniture store back in at the time that the Minister Bernard Badcoux was the Minister of Indigenous Aboriginal Affairs. And I asked him, I want to sell my mattresses to the shipbuilding down here in Halifax. And I asked him about that because at that time it was 10% procurement. And he said, yeah, he said it is the law, but there's nobody pushing it. So that's a problem from the very beginning. You had this in place and there was nobody governing it or managing it to ensure that we did receive our 10%.
Just to quickly probe that in the time I have left, though, can I ask, I mean, why isn't there a lining up of the federal government's qualification with the qualifications that are coming from Indigenous communities? Why is there a dissonance between what they're calling an Indigenous business and what you're calling an Indigenous business?
Well, it's because there's no verification. I mean, at the end of the day, they seem to think that if you walk in the door, you cannot ask if a proof of Indigenous. And that's where the problem lies. When anybody can walk in the door and say, I'm Inuit, I'm Métis, or I'm First Nations, without any verification. And as you know, First Nations communities and band members have received their status from Ottawa. Membership on the other Indigenous organizations, I'm not sure how that's working, but that's questionable to me as a First Nations person. And I just want to ensure that we are doing this in a correct way and stop going behind closed doors and coming out with documents to say, this is what we have as a policy, now tweak it. You wasted time and money. As I mentioned earlier, we need to be at the forefront of this discussion, and because we know where the needs are within these policies. So please, take that into consideration before moving forward. Again, going behind closed doors and saying, well, we heard from them, and this is what we come up with. That's got to stop. They've done it for years and years and years, and it's got to stop. It's wasting government money as well as your time and my time.
Thanks very much, Mr. Ducharme. Maybe we can get to you the next intervention. Mr. Batiste, please go ahead.
Thank you for that, Regional Chief Bernard. It's good to see you. Regional Chief, I understand from your testimony that there is not one way in which all three First Nations, Métis, and Inuit determine indigeneity. Would you say that's accurate?
Yes.
And can you tell us a little bit about how First Nations status works? I know that me and you have had conversations about the second generation cutoff, but can you explain it to the committee in just a minute?
Yes, I will try to do that in a minute. Basically, the First Nations status is cut off after the second generation. problem with the Métis membership. They could be 10 generations down, and they just have to say that their grandfather or great-grandfather or great-grandmother was Indigenous, and they become members. So there is a very distinct problem there when it comes to why are we as First Nations being cut off after second generations and the membership of the Métis and Inuit? I'm not sure, like I said, the details, but it's very concerning to to First Nations communities.
So we lost you there for a little bit. You know, as a status Indian, I might have a child with someone who's outside of the Indian Act, and that child would therefore become what they call a 6'2" Indian. But if that child was to have a child with someone who isn't a part of this Indian Act, then they would lose status. And that's how second generation cutoff works. Is that correct in your mind frame?
Yes, it is when you're speaking of status, because in a lot of communities like mine, we are allowing our descendants to become members. They may not have status, but they are band members of our communities because we have control of our membership list. Status is a different story. But if a First Nation person who is non-status can prove maybe a letter from the Chief of Council, yes, they are members of our community, then they should be.
So the complexity involved in this, Joanna, is much more than just having a template for who is and who isn't Indigenous. Do you think that, and you know what, I'll go to the Métis as well in terms of asking this question. Is there one way to determine who is Métis between all of the different Métis organizations in Canada?
Well, you look at me as representing the entire Métis. I am Métis myself, but I don't represent.
To your understanding, is there one way in which we determine Métis that's uniform across Canada?
Manitoba Métis Federation, you have to have a family member, a descendant that was attached to Métis script. All 8 of my great-grandparents have Métis script applications. They have their X they weren't able to read. You go through that, they have to go through the St. Boniface Historical Society, provide all your genealogy documents to prove who your descendants are to qualify for Métis.
But there's no cutoff, correct? There's no second generation. They won't tell you you have to marry within that.
No.
Okay. Do you understand that? Would you say that the Manitoba Métis Federation have the same criteria as BC or Ontario?
I have not applied to either one of those provinces, so I don't know their criteria. My
Okay.
understanding is with the Ontario Métis, they were supposed to be part of a historical Métis community.
Well, I guess in terms of being able to answer this question, do you think that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit should all have a distinct way of determining who they are, that they tell the government on how to do this, instead of basically the government trying to find one box to lump everyone into Indigenous and say, check this box and show the determination, when you have a various way across not just this country, but across the world of determining indigeneity?
There should be, I think, for First Nations, the one that are losing their status after 2 generations, as Chief Bernard said, that the community, they're band members, they don't have the status. But I think that should be allowed, because, I mean, just because you've buried outside of being Indigenous, that still makes you Indigenous. So I think Indigenous people are the ones that are best to determine who's an Indigenous person.
But I guess the question is, instead of just saying Indigenous in a blanket way, should we make it distinctions based, where we have the First Nations determining who's a First Nation, the Métis determining who's a Métis, and the Inuit determining who's an Inuit, instead of trying to lump them all into one box?
If you're going to distinguish between the 3 Indigenous groups, yes.
Do you think that would be helpful?
It would be helpful, but it could also cause challenges, I think. I think it seems as though we're being separated. We've always been separated as Indigenous peoples. I have cousins that are First Nation members that I consider brothers or sisters, but I'm Métis, and I feel that we're always trying to be separated. It feels like people are nervous. If we came together, we'd be stronger as a collective.
I think
we seem to be
that's one way of
putting together.
defining it. But if there's different criteria for different folks, don't you feel that it should be within those communities to determine themselves, instead of trying to make one program work for everyone? Because, as you said, there's no cutoff date for anyone involved in Métis and Manitoba who's related to script. But you've just heard from Regional Chief Bernard that after 2 generations, the Indian Act ensures that there's a cutoff date. So how can you be fair to both and say here's what we're going to put on the table for everyone when we know that one only can just pass their genes down for 2 generations and one can do it in perpetuity.
Well, I think what I did agree to Chief Bernard was saying that they do recognize them as a band member. I'm saying that they're not just because the government with the 2-generation cutoff makes them not status. They are still Indigenous in my view. And I think that was the community that has decided they're a member and they're part of the community. With the Métis, you have to be recognized by a community as being a member of that community as well.
So short question, Joanna, do you think it should be distinctions based? The First Nation determine the First Nations, the Métis determine the Métis, and the Inuit determine the Inuit, instead of having a boxed approach to indigeneity?
I do believe there's a problem there, as we only have a 5% procurement strategy. And if you look at the membership over almost 1 million First Nations people across Canada, and then the Indigenous, the other national organizations, what are their population? And their population list or their membership list is, to me, not really valid when we can't add second generation and more where they can. So the validity of the membership from Métis is questionable in my opinion. There should be something where across the board where it is verified, not just saying, well, my great-great-grandfather or grandmother is Indigenous, so that makes me Métis and then become a member. And my concern with the 5% is when you're looking at the AFN with the huge population compared to the other 2 smaller organizations, where is that going to be fair for the procurement strategy, making sure that Indigenous First Nations and peoples are getting a chunk of that 5%? Because I worry that the procurement will allow a Métis or First Nations to take it all. Or the majority of it. And that's where we need to ensure that we're not being cut off because the 5% is reached. So now First Nations communities or businesses, actually it's not communities, it's businesses. It has nothing to do with the community. We could talk about that at another time because there should be benefits to the community. But like I said, it's just not working, Jamie.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Vignola, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Ducharme, Ms. Bernard, thank you very much for being with us today. This is a topic that is very important because giving 5% of contracts, as you stated, to a certain group is only a small, very small part of all government contracts, as you stated. Unfortunately, there seem to be businesses that are being used as a front. That is, a business that is not Indigenous will associate itself with an Indigenous business. And then in the end, the work is done by non-Indigenous people and businesses. Of course, the person who is directing the Indigenous company will get a part of the money, but the rest of it will go elsewhere. And that takes away the real impact that this policy could have. Now, the goal of this policy is to ensure a better life and autonomy for Indigenous communities and better growth also. In the end, that's what we're aiming for. My first question on that, and then afterwards I'll ask about how to prepare for more autonomy. My first question is the following. How can we ensure that an Indigenous business, I'll start with you, Mr. Ducharme, and then Ms. Bernard afterwards, if you could answer, how an Indigenous business is not used as a front rather, how can we make sure that doesn't happen? So that it gives non-Indigenous businesses access to contracts that were supposed to be for Indigenous businesses. Thank you.
I think that can be achieved through audits of the actual contracts. If you look at the contracts, if it's a joint venture, and you go through all the subcontracting, you see where the payments are going, how much of the money is actually staying with the Indigenous community, that should be the amount that's reported. If you look at some of these big contracts, they could be up to $100 million, which is a JV. That full $100 million is getting credit as Indigenous spend. And in reality, there's no way that it's $100 million. And in best case scenario, if the Indigenous partner has a 51%, they would be getting potentially $51 million of the value of that contract. that should be something that's reported to make these companies that are getting advantage of this to say, okay, you know what, we're going to get a $100 million contract that's going to go so far to the 5%. And in reality, only maybe 5% of that 100 million is going to the Indigenous. Only that 5% of that 100 million should be reported as Indigenous spend. And that would bring the numbers down to more realistic and showing that the true benefit that's going to the Indigenous communities or businesses or peoples is what is spent. So I think there has to be audits, post-award contract audits.
Madame Bernard?
Definitely seems like there's a lot of work to do to ensure that this is done correctly and to ensure that it is over time immemorial. The government is giving us under the Indigenous file all this money, but if you look at whatever they're giving us, the percentage of that money doesn't go to the communities. It's going to the organizations to administer the work to be done in Indigenous affairs. So the numbers should reflect the money that is going to the communities and not the amount of money the government is putting up to pay non-natives to do a lot of this work and make it look like you've given all this money to the Indigenous people, whether it's a procurement or anything else. There's a need to ensure, as I mentioned, there's only 1% of the procurement that was given out in 2015. And if you look in your records, it's gonna look like you've given way more than that, but yet the numbers have been totaled at 93.5 million in 2015, but you're saying that there was billions of dollars given. And so there's a concern there. There needs a lot of work to be done, not on this, only on this issue, but other issues within the procurement.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ducharme, I'll ask you another question. And I'll use your own story to illustrate, and mine, I mean, by association, because I'm in an urban community. When we're in a rural or remote community with classes that count less than 10 people, sometimes that we need to go study elsewhere, that can complicate things. There's very little access, and they're complicated to education, that is, when you live in a remote community. Does that aspect, in terms of growth and autonomy, economic growth and autonomy for a community that is not having easy access to education easily, can that put a brake on things? Should we focus on that also so that it can help create businesses later among Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit communities?
I think putting in tools that are going to help people that come in from out of their communities to better equip themselves to be able to be successful is required. I think when we look at Indigenous procurement, a lot of our urban-based businesses, stats show that we're hiring Indigenous peoples. We're bringing them into a place where they're comfortable. We're providing different working conditions for them. In Saskatchewan, some of the companies, when an Indigenous person comes in, they let them take time off in the fall to go do goose hunting or to do the hunting season. And I think by increasing our opportunities for our Indigenous businesses, we in turn are hiring our own people. And I think this is sort of similar to what you're talking about, I think, is creating a safe environment, an environment where they can grow. And again, our Indigenous businesses are proud. They bring in someone, they train them, they get their certificates or get their red seal. They may leave to another opportunity, but it has given success to a cousin, to a family member. I consider us all family members as Indigenous peoples.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Oh, and I'll ask another question later.
Thank you, Mrs. Vignola. Mr. Bachrach, please go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Chief Bernard and Mr. Ducharme for joining the committee today on this important topic. I wish I could be with committee members in person today. I'm actually in Terrace, British Columbia, in the northwest of the province, and I'm here to honor the memory of Chief Don Roberts of Kitsim-Kalem. Chief Roberts was not only a hereditary chief with Kitsim-Kalem, he was also the elected band chief for almost 20 years. And I mention this because among his many strengths, Chief Roberts was a strong proponent for Indigenous business and for economic development in his community. And so today, as his family prepares for his memorial this afternoon, my thoughts are with all those who are missing Chief Roberts. And this is a really important topic and an interesting one. I think it's also, as has been mentioned, it's a bit fraught because, as Mr. Ducharme said, the focus on the instances of fraud and I guess you could say identity theft risks overshadowing the successes of Indigenous businesses. And I want to start by just noting and agreeing with that important point. I'm curious about the target setting by the government and whether setting a 5% target and directing the public service to achieve that target through procurement risks overlooking some of these instances of problematic procurement. That is, does it create an incentive to overlook these in the interest of meeting the target? We heard from Mr. Ducharme that, if you were to subtract the value that is being subcontracted out to non-Indigenous businesses, the actual value being delivered to legitimate Indigenous businesses would be significantly less. And therefore, the government would miss its target and would probably pay some political price. So my question for Chief Bernard and Mr. Ducharme, does the target itself create a problem when it comes to ensuring transparency and integrity in the Indigenous procurement process?
Do I go first?
Sure.
Thank you. So does the target cause a problem, is basically in reference to getting to that 5%. And I think one of the speakers mentioned something about, prove your status by downloading a picture of a bunny just to show status. This is ridiculous, and this came out of the government department telling this person to do so. So there alone tells me there is a problem. They're trying to reach their target, and that this is what they're doing. It's just not the way to go, for sure. And it is causing an issue amongst the Indigenous communities or businesses. I keep on saying communities. I want to identify here because this procurement may help the communities because the Indigenous businesses are in that community. But if we're also looking to advance our communities with economic development, we have to look at giving Aboriginal benefit to the communities where a First Nation business gets a contract. They agree to maybe giving scholarships of, if there's a percentage of their revenues, they can give scholarships within their community to help the students, as mentioned by one of the speakers, helping our students. It's not easy to take a student out of the community that's way up north and sending them to school out of their region. That costs money, and we just don't get enough from the government for that. So I'm looking for a potential avenue to support First Nations through an Aboriginal benefit strategy for the communities as well as the business entrepreneur, the Indigenous entrepreneur.
Thank you. Mr. Ducharme?
Thank you. I do believe the 5% was required. It was after the 5% was mandated that a lot of the work was done. Again, the 5% is just the floor. It's we need to have at least that 5%. And again, unless we have targets and we measure and report, there's never going to be success. If PSAB, PSIB, whatever, it's been a few different names, has been going on this long and there's never been a set target, there has been no movement. I know there's been issues. I think the way it's set up right now, the government is close to meeting that 5%. But again, I think we still have to look at the actual audit of the contracts to see that value. And the 5% is very important because if we don't have something to strive for or reach for, it's never going to happen. But again, that being said, it can also cause some issues because people think it almost feels like the other 95% of government contract peoples want a portion of our 5%, which really makes it difficult for us. So, but I think the 5% is very important. And it's a start.
If I could clarify, you're saying that the target is important because it motivates the government to increase Indigenous procurement, but that the target shouldn't come at the cost of the integrity of the procurement itself. Is that a fair characterization?
Yes.
Okay. Now we've talked about your organization, Mr. Ducharme, does maintains a directory of Indigenous businesses, and there's a process for certifying businesses and ensuring the integrity of the directory. Indigenous Services Canada also has a directory of Indigenous businesses. Is there an opportunity there to reconcile these two directories and have one directory that is informed by the work of organizations like yours?
I think there is. I am quite confident with the directory that we do have. It was interesting when one of the first speakers did say that the Indigenous Services Minister said that their sole purpose was to confirm indigeneity. My understanding was the Indigenous Business Directory was made of different components, not just indigeneity, but to show the ownership and control with those documents. We don't do the certification for the government, so I can't speak to what all their processes are, but I know that what we do, we try to the best of our ability to ensure that these businesses that we do certify do meet the criteria, and we do require the documentation. Again, it is something that is received from the status cards for First Nations. For the Métis people, it's the MNC governing bodies, as well as the Manitoba Métis Federation and the IBD. So I think we could do it quite well, and I think we've proven ourselves with our corporate members. As I said, we deal a lot with corporate Canada, and we have a lot of opportunities for Indigenous businesses. Government procurement is not the be-all, end-all for Indigenous business. It's a piece of the pie, but I think we have a good program.
Mr. Chair, do I have a couple of seconds for one more question?
No, we're about a minute and a half past your time.
Okay.
Before we continue with the next round with Mr. Genuis, colleagues, as is our habit or my habit, we've let the first round go past everyone's time, which is fine. It's an important study, but please, for the next rounds, leave ample time for answers and responses from our witnesses. Mr. Genuis, go ahead, please, sir.
Mr. Ducharme, just very directly building off the round of questioning we just had, you have a list of Indigenous businesses. You work hard on it. You engage to make sure that that list is accurate. It's reflective of very clear criteria. The federal government does not use your list. They have their own list, and we've seen various revelations about how flawed their processes are. I don't understand why the federal government wouldn't just engage with Indigenous leaders, Indigenous business organizations to say, can we use the list you're developing to identify Indigenous businesses for our own procurement policies? Is there any impediment that I'm missing to simply taking on this collaborative approach that would use the work that's already being done?
I think it would be a very simple process to have us recognized. And I do know with Defence Construction Canada, when they talk to Indigenous businesses or corporate Canada for subcontract opportunities, they do talk about the CCIB Indigenous Business List. Unfortunately, right now it's not recognized. They still have to be within the Indigenous Business Directory. But we have been advocating because, again, we are very confident the businesses that we do have are Indigenous businesses. Corporate Canada leans on our list for their Indigenous procurement.
Right. So the private sector is using your list. I'm hearing you saying there's no impediment, and I would just add this is so typical of the way the federal government often operates, is trying to replicate work that's already being done and doing it less well. I also want to follow up directly on Mr. Baptiste's questions. When it comes to Indigenous identity, I think we all understand that there are going to be some complex or marginal cases, but there are also some very clear-cut cases. As part of one of these investigations, a reporter was able to get certification, so-called, through an online attestation. Now, I believe that Indigenous identity is something real. It's not how you feel. It's not something that someone like me can just decide they want and claim it. It's something that is real and objective. Now, in that context, I note that a couple members of Parliament, both themselves Indigenous, have used the word pretendian or pretendianism to describe this phenomenon of people kind of outright pretending to be Indigenous in order to benefit. So I want to ask you kind of a multi-part question about that. The first is just on language. Do you think this terminology is appropriate? Is this terminology we should be using or not? Secondly, my understanding is that concerns about this falsification of identity are broader than just procurement, that we see other instances, in fact, where this pretending to be Indigenous is causing problems, and what can we do about it? And then just thirdly, would you agree with what I said at the beginning, that Indigenous identity is something objective? It's not a subjective question of how you feel. It's an objective, verifiable reality. So for this, maybe we'll start with Chief Bernard, and then hopefully there'll be some time for Mr. Ducharme.
Yeah, it's an issue definitely in regards to the verification of the status. I mean, or the validity of the Indigenous aspect of any individual, and it's just not right that it's different for each of the three different organizations. There needs to be some consistency in those three when we're verifying who is Indigenous and who is not. Because as mentioned before, I could see your name there, Genuous? I can't see it. Okay, anyways, I see it a little bit there. Just to say that it needs to have some consistency. As First Nations status goes, it's cut off at the second generation, whereas the other issues and validity of Indigenousy is it's a free-for-all. As mentioned before, you just pop up a bunny picture and you're Indigenous, which I don't understand how that ever happened. And if that person happens to be on one of the lists of the national organizations. And again, I do question the validity of those memberships. If there's a First Nations person who falsely received their status, they are revoked. When they are brought to the forefront, the federal government has taken back those status from those individuals who falsely claimed. So it would be the same for all of the three organizations.
And to get Mr. Ducharme, because I cut him off last time. So
and real quick, because I'm going to end up cutting you off.
Unfortunately, when you said terminology, I kind of lost what you were requesting, asking. But I think
just the word pretendian that some members.
Pretendian is something that it's just very. I'm in my 50s. I've been around a long time. I've faced a lot of discrimination. When I first started hearing people pretending or trying to be Indigenous, I took them at face value. Why would someone want to be Indigenous with all the issues that we had in the prairies to be Indigenous? I mean, if I could have hit it, I would have hit it, but I couldn't hit it. I was physically visible as an Indigenous person. So the pretendian is something that's it's a very personal thing that, I mean, it's shocking that it's happening and it's sad, but again, sometimes it is. People are taking advantage of it, but anything, people try and take advantage. You're always going to find unscrupulous people that take advantage of being Indigenous.
Thank you very much. Mr. Baines.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Ducharme, I come from Richmond, British Columbia, the traditional territory of the Coast Salish Musqueam peoples, and Boeing has a 100-year history there, and they recently made a investment of about $61 million, and out of which 13 million went to Coda Aviation. It's a manufacturing firm. They make machinery and parts. They're a supplier for Boeing now. And I'm just curious, what role does the private sector have when it comes to Indigenous procurement?
I think the private sector has led on Indigenous procurement in Canada. I'm more familiar with what's going on out west. I'm from Saskatchewan, but I think if you look at the resource sector, they have led the way. When you look at the Wood Buffalo region, all that's been done there. I think corporate Canada is also a little bit more flexible. They can when they look at their procurement opportunities, if the top guy says, you know what, we're going to use this person, it's going to happen. It's a little bit different, but I think corporate Canada, I think, is realizing that by utilizing Indigenous businesses, it is growing the Indigenous economy. Ultimately, it's always a business case. I mean, when you grow the Indigenous economy, hopefully they're in turn are going to be buying your products or services. But I think corporate Canada is really making a good effort. Coda Aviation, again, which you outlined, was one of the first Indigenous businesses to get a Tier 1 contract with the Navy on submarine retrofitting. So again, it is showing success, and I think corporate Canada has done a great job.
And I know that it was discussed earlier about the directory, and you said CCIB has its own, and the government has its own. How are there commonalities between these lists, or how different are they? And are you aware of the differences between these lists?
Well, again, I don't know the process that the government uses. I mean, when you go online and look at the government process to be registered as an Indigenous business, it does say you have to include the proof of indigeneity. You have to include the documentation to show it. I mean, that would be very similar. We followed a bit of the guidelines to look at that. We also looked at the US, where supplier diversity is sort of a component of that. That's been happening since 1968. So the documentation to prove the 51%. I mean, the government list, I'm not in the back end of the government, so I don't do their certification. I'm quite confident with what we do for certification. And it was something that our corporate members also wanted to ensure. We did a survey in 2016 and 72% of them wanted to ensure that if they were working with Indigenous businesses, that it was a bona fide Indigenous business and not someone claiming indigeneity just to take advantage of a programming.
Have you in any way had an opportunity not to even sort of cross-reference what they can have that consultation process with the government side on lists, and is there a consultation process that you're working on consistently on a consistent basis with the government?
We do the work a lot with the federal government. I mean, a lot of the stuff I can't speak to it. I mean, I know the one they're talking about, the bunny. I mean, I think there is some context that hasn't been brought forward to that one. I mean, it was an Indigenous, the tribal council that owned the business, was my understanding. And some programs you have to upload a document. So I mean, maybe the documentation showed that this company was owned by Pasqua First Nation Tribal Council, but the programming required a picture of a status card or a picture of a Métis citizenship card to be uploaded. So it's possible that person would have said, you know what, just upload a picture of a bunny. Something has to go in there to be able to make that system grow. Again, so many things, people jump to conclusions and try and make it worse than what it is. We don't know the full extent of what that certification process was. So I wouldn't want to throw them under the bus and say they're not doing it right, because I think they are trying their best. And I think the government, and I mean, even having these discussions is showing that it is something that's valid, and we want to make sure it's going to be successful.
How much time, Mr. Chair? Okay, and I'm just going to ask a little bit about the Indigenous business supply chain. Is it generally possible to find and use Indigenous businesses throughout the supply chain? How hard is that process? I'm just wondering, like, when we talked about a target of 5%, that's just a minimum, right? That's just like something to get to. And I think I saw in 2022, 23, the number's gone up to 6.26% of its contracts are gone to Indigenous businesses. So exceeding it, it's not that we're just trying to get to 5%. It's about getting more. And sometimes there could be a situation where there's not that many businesses, but are we able to find through the supply chain businesses?
I think they say there's
there
upward
was
of
no
60.
time left for
Oh, sorry.
a response. We'll go to Mrs. Vignola, please, or 2.5, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Listen, I'm listening to you, and I have so many questions. I'm taking tons of notes, but I'll try to be quick. Ms. Bernard. And Mr. Ducharme, you can add on also. Who is best placed to determine who an Indigenous person is? First Nations, Indigenous, and so on. The federal government or elsewhere?
The federal government is telling us here whether we're a status or not for the First Nations. They're not doing that on the other side, whether it's Métis or Inuit. They're doing it on their own. They don't have the government doing the second generation cutoff like the government does for us as First Nations. So there's a concern I have there. And if the government wishes to continue.
Je vais vous couper. Je m'excuse.
Sorry, I have to cut you off. I'm very sorry. I understand that currently it's the federal government that is making that determination. Is it well placed to do that, or should it be left up to the communities themselves?
Well, I truly believe it should be the First Nation, but there's a process to that. Some First Nations have their own registry and their membership. So they do it with I think it's called section or band 10. So that allows them to have their own membership. You have to work towards that, and First Nations to get to that point, but it doesn't matter even if you have your own membership. The government does not recognize after the second generation for First Nations, and that's where lies the problem. If the government stepped away from that and allowed us to allow our descendants to be on there, we wouldn't have an issue with the whether Inuit or Métis. But I personally have an issue when the government is controlling First Nations, but yet not the membership of the other two organizations. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. I have about 30 seconds left, and I'll take this opportunity to make a comment. I do not understand why the Indian Act is still being applied as it is being done, and that it's still the federal government determines who First Nation, Métis, or Inuit person is a First Nation, Métis, or Inuit person. It's not up to the federal government to determine that. You are not eternally children. You are not minors. And it is more than time that we give you back that autonomy, that possibility to grow, that to you and your communities. That's clear and simple. Thank you.
Signola, back to you, Mr. Backrack, please, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chief Bernard, you said something I found very interesting in one of the previous rounds of questions about the benefit to community. And, you know, this is something that as a party, we wholeheartedly support writ large, not just for Indigenous procurement, but for procurement in general, that when governments spend millions or billions of dollars on infrastructure projects, for example, there should be benefits that go to communities. There should be apprentices. There should be women employed. There should be some legacy. There should be local employment. And so this is something I think that's very germane. And yet I've seen representatives of this federal government get up in the House and say that Indigenous procurement is solely about the individuals receiving the contracts. It isn't about community. Is this a gap? Is this something that your organization has brought up with the government as a shortcoming? I just notice quite a stark contrast between the comments of the government and the comments that you made before the committee just a moment ago.
Well, First Nations are government. They're not in the business of doing business. They are not entrepreneurs. They are government. They do need help and in-house resources as much as they can. You know, we're not the only department that is not funded sufficiently, as you know, like education across the board is not sufficient, like anything else. So the only way for us to get ahead of that is to have some in-house resources and revenues. And one way to do that is to look at the local economy, looking to set up a scholarship to help our students get to school, or to help build a park, or help build a health center. These are the things that benefits could go to the community. So there is a difference between Indigenous entrepreneurs who are not government, and you don't want the government to be involved in this. I mean, if for some reason I'm an entrepreneur and I don't like the chief and the chief don't like me, I get nothing, which is why they never worked for fisheries and never worked for forestry. They gave the allocations to the community, and then the chief and council made these decisions who had no background in fisheries or forestry. So this comes back full circle here. That's where we are today, and we need to look at ways that we can benefit the communities through Aboriginal benefits, which would it be a percentage to help scholarships or anything within that region where that work is being done. Thank you.
Thanks. So thanks very much. Mrs. Block, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both Chief Bernard and Mr. Ducharme for joining us today. My first question can go to either one of you. In August of 2021, the government made its target of having each department award at least 5% of their total contract value to Indigenous-owned businesses mandatory. So it's my understanding that before 2021, there was a target, but it wasn't mandatory. Can either of you comment on the level of Indigenous participation in federal contracting prior to this target being made mandatory?
Well, I think if you looked at the numbers are quite a bit lower, that they weren't there. I think it was showing maybe around 1% of it. I think it was first announced in 2019, where I think it was part of the mandate letter to look at setting a target of 5%. And that was when we first started talking about the 5% Indigenous procurement target. It is still difficult for a lot of businesses with the federal government and federal procurement. I think it needs to be simplified. I think they need to look at some of the levels of requirements for their contracts. A $150,000 or $100,000 contract requires the same amount of work as a $10 or $20 million. Small Indigenous businesses and all smaller businesses in Canada don't have the resources to do that. So I think there is still some struggles, but some of these other big ones, like when we look at the reporting from 2023, where it was on paper at 6.27% of the value went to Indigenous businesses, but in reality, we did not get that.
Thank you very much. And that's a great segue into my next question. As you noted, it was reported that the value of government contracts awarded under the program has risen sharply to $862 million in the 2022 fiscal year, which is up from $170 million in the 5 years prior. And according to the 2022-2023 ISC report on the mandatory minimum 5% target, it was reported that 6.27% of all contracts were awarded to Indigenous businesses. And on the face of it, that would appear like the government has already exceeded the targets that they set for 24-25. However, as we all know, the devil is often in the detail, which is why our committee undertook this study. From bombshell reports over the summer, we know that this government has done little to no vetting of businesses to ensure they qualify as Indigenous businesses, and my colleague has done a great job in digging into that. But, you know, when we were passing this motion to study this program, we were told by government members that we didn't understand what the purpose of this program was all about, and that it was running just fine and accomplishing the purpose for which it was created. Are you concerned at all that the current government sees no issues with the abuse that has been uncovered, particularly the so-called rent-a-feather scheme, or the lack of concern about verifying the Indigenous identity of businesses before giving them access to the program? And I'll turn to Chief Ducharme. Sorry, Chief Bernard.
Thank you. I do want to note that those numbers have not been verified. The research that you did shows that it went to an Indigenous company, but if you look deeper, you will find that that is not true when you go into each individual contract and who was part of it. Was it a shell company? Even though in your reporting it shows that it's Indigenous, it may not have been. So in reality, that so-called 6% is probably down more like 1%. I just don't understand. At one point it was 10% when the first Aboriginal procurement strategy came out. It was 10%. There was no governing of it. Nothing was done to enforce it, as mentioned. And then in 2019, according to what I just heard, that they've been starting to try to enforce it, but yet they're not looking into the details. As you know, the devil is in the details to verify actually how much that Indigenous company or person or entrepreneur received, because they're the majority of them, I hate to say this, is they are shell companies, and so it's important to really go deeper to see where that percentage is at. And to me, it would probably be more down in the 1%. But I'm not understanding here that the government is now wanting to give 5%, but couldn't even manage the 10%. So what's going to be different now? Anyways, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Back to you, Mr. Batiste.
Mr. Ducharme, I was really interested in the discussion you had about the uploading of the picture. Now, you know, I know many communities, many First Nations across Canada also have corporate divisions within their communities. I know that in Eskasoni, the community that I'm from, has an eagle that represents their corporates. I've seen others in the West use buffaloes. In British Columbia, they use the orcas. Is it possible that this narrative that the media and the Conservatives has spun about a bunny being used to verify verification was actually the government just asking for a picture that representative of their community?
I don't know if it was representative of their community, but again, I have been to places where I've been told, like even some online platforms where they say just upload a blank document or something because the system requires something to be put in. Again, I'm just speculating, but when I look at it, from the business, it was reported that it was a community-owned business. Well, a community isn't going to have a status card on its own. So maybe that could have been why it was determined that to just upload a picture and to bypass the system so that you can actually go through the certification process. And again, I'm speculating. I did not do the certification.
Okay. Regional Chief Bernard, do you believe that it's important to have a percentage of the procurement going to Indigenous communities, First Nations communities, Inuit and Métis? And do you see this as something that's valued in terms of the efforts made to decrease the gap of Indigenous-owned businesses in Canada?
I definitely do think that it's essential to help the communities and poverty within the communities, because if there's a community entrepreneur that is making money, his money is being spent within his community. So it does benefit the community a bit. And in regards to the tribal councils, they are owned by the First Nations. So the First Nation has a band number. So to so-called rabbit pictures, it doesn't make sense. You just show that you are from that community and what that community band number is, and it's registered in Canada. Each community is registered with the number. So that would be the way to do it, and not just as a tribal council, because they don't have an individual band member. So there's ways about that this can be done efficiently and properly to ensure that the word tribal council, anybody could use it. So to me, I'm assuming that a tribal council is consisting of multiple, maybe at least 3 First Nations, and in doing so, they can use their band numbers for that community instead of a status number.
And Regional Chief, I share with you the concerns around the Indian Act and the cutoff. I know that we've had conversations of this. I've had conversations with the National Chief. You know, when we passed Bill C-15 on UNDRIP, it actually has a clause under Article 33 in UNDRIP that says Indigenous people have the right to determine their own identity or membership in accordance with their customs and traditions. This does not impair the right of Indigenous individuals to obtain citizenships of the states which they live. And so if C-15 has now received royal assent, and United Nations Declarations of the Rights of Indigenous People is the law, and we believe in Canada that this is the law, has AFN tabled any kind of resolutions in which they could assist the government in determining a better system for us to determine status as a moving forward?
As you know, I mean, there are a lot of resolutions that are being passed in reference to this. And all I have to say is stop doing the work behind closed doors, bring us to the table, work with us. We will help you to have a better understanding and how to get these policies and even legislation changed. But we need to be there with you. We need to work from the very beginning of the issue, not like after, all these years go by and time is wasted, money is wasted, and then say, well, how can we do to fix it? Just bring us in from the beginning. And I think that should help in reference to the getting this right finally.
Thank you, Joe.
In order to,
Regional Chief, I just wanted to, isn't that the process that the minister is currently undertaking with AFN? I know she's working with the Youth Council, the AFN, in a consultation process that opened up in December to explore ways around the second generation cutoff.
well,
I'm
yes,
sorry,
and I
I'm just
think
going to
they are-
interrupt. Sorry, I'm going to
Yes or
interrupt
no would
just
be
very
fine.
briefly. Do you mind moving your mic down about perfect. Thanks very much. And we're not out of time. You have about 25 seconds to
Okay.
respond, please.
Okay. Well, I just want to say there should be a cutoff for other organizations. If you're going to do it with the First Nations cutoff, then you must do it with the other organizations. And if you don't, then stop the cutoff after second generation. Let us decide who are the people living in our communities. Because as you know, if you're living in the community and you are not status, you don't get funding for it, but we put them as members in our communities because we take care of our families. And there's no way in heck that we could tell the Prime Minister that his grandchild is not his blood. So come on, we got to fix this. And that's another subject. I mean, you know as well as I do.
Yeah, thank you, Joanna. And I just, if you could, I'm out of time here, but if AFN has any reports or resolutions that they could table to help this committee determine what they feel is the best way to determine First Nation identity, I think that would be very helpful. And I think that before the end of this committee, that document would be really well received by this committee.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Kusi, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much, Mr. Ducharme and Chief Bernard, for being here with us today. I just want to go back to some previous testimony of yours, Mr. Ducharme, in 2018, prior to the August 6, 2021 announcement, to sort of measure what you said, what you suggested, I should say, versus what the government produced. So in 2018, when OGO previously studied this issue, your organization sent in a brief that stated the federal government should award points to bidders based on their relationships with Indigenous businesses and communities to ensure that there is Indigenous engagement throughout their supply chain. Is this a recommendation that was accepted and acted upon by this government, in your opinion?
I'm sorry, don't quite understand. Like, was that from corporations that would have to ensure that they had Indigenous inclusion within their opportunity?
Yes, that in going through a procurement process,
Yes.
that more points should be awarded to those bidders who have relationships with Indigenous businesses and communities. So not significantly, or not, pardon me, not solely on the basis of being recognized as Indigenous through the self-proclamation or officially as the processes we have heard throughout the testimony of this committee, but through the relationships. Do you believe that do you still believe that's important? And do you believe that this recommendation was incorporated into the process?
It has been implemented into some of the process, and I think that's within the Indigenous participation plans. A lot of the government, there is no standard procedure right now or threshold for that. But some of the bigger contracts, there is an Indigenous participation in the plan that's included within it. And within that participation plan, they talk about community investment, they talk about employment, subcontracting opportunities, and they are awarded points for that. The evaluation of that has to happen with all of them. I know the federal government, and again, there should be a threshold. It shouldn't be just at the discretion of the contracting authority as to whether or not to include an Indigenous participation plan. I think that's very valuable because, again, that does give the smaller ones. And it's also, as when the Chief Bernard was talking about with the community investment, within these participation plans, they will go into the community. They might help with building a school, building a park. It is happening more. They're seeing it more. That's why some of our corporate members are also hoping that the federal government would recognize our certified Indigenous businesses because they are working with those businesses, and that could be included within their Indigenous participation plan results.
Thank you for that. However, in the 2018 study, government officials also testified that they encouraged Indigenous businesses to enter joint ventures with non-Indigenous businesses to bid on contracts. In your opinion, should this practice be encouraged, or should the focus be entirely on improving socioeconomic outcomes for First Nations? I shouldn't say entirely, it should be entirely based on that, but should that be done through the not encouraging Indigenous businesses to enter joint ventures with non-Indigenous businesses?
Well, I think joint ventures do have a place, and they are required because if the smaller Indigenous business, a lot of it could also even be with the insurance requirements, with the bid bonding, that the Indigenous business does not have the capacity to be able to do that. The non-Indigenous business of joint ventures is there to help the Indigenous business grow. There should be a shelf life for a joint venture. I mean, there's been times where a joint venture has been going on 20 years. If it's a true joint venture, that non-Indigenous partner should have helped that Indigenous partner be able to become their own prime contractor themselves. So joint ventures are important, but they have to be looked at and ensure that the benefit is going out. There is growth to the Indigenous businesses. It can't be something that's always going to be able to bid on these contracts and be getting contracts for 20 years because of a JV, and there has been no growth for the Indigenous partner.
In our evaluation of the ArriveCan scandal, we found that there were significant faults in the subcontracting processes. So in your opinion, should there be an overview of the subcontracting process to ensure Indigenous involvement throughout the supply chain?
There is, and that's where I've been saying earlier that there should be a pre-award, post-contract audit done to ensure that what has been claimed to be benefiting Indigenous businesses is happening. for those ArriveCan contracts. Again, I'm not privy to them. I don't know what it is. I just see what the media, and again, media or what is reported needs to be taken with a grain of salt. But if they actually looked at that, and if there was a value to say, okay, well, within that ArriveCan, that went towards the PSIB or the amount of Indigenous procurement. I don't understand. I don't know if any of that value went to the procurement strategy for Indigenous business as part of Indigenous spend.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Tusmirchuk, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Ducharme, for being here today. Before I became a member of Parliament, I worked for a regional innovation center, WeTech Alliance, and we helped establish a program. We worked with First Nations, Indigenous partners to establish a program called Supporting Aboriginal Youth Entrepreneurs in Windsor, Essex, SAWI. Fantastic program. And it's through that program that I got a chance to also learn about the incredible work of the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business, the CCIB. Wonderful organization, great work. And I also learned that the fastest growing segment of entrepreneurs in Canada are Indigenous businesses. There was one particular young entrepreneur who started a company called Culture Shock, selling jewelry and apparel. And I can tell you the immense pride we all felt when that entrepreneur opened up a bricks and mortar storefront in Windsor several years ago to great success. It was wonderful to be part of that. How important is it? You mentioned, you yourself in your opening statement mentioned a successful company that was very successful through its procurement, through this procurement process, federal procurement process. How important is it, in your opinion, to share the success stories of Indigenous businesses working through the federal procurement program? How important is it to get those good stories out?
Thank you. And thank you for the compliments for CCIB. I would also like to recognize that our president and CEO, Tabitha Bull, is actually sitting right behind me. She should have been up here. And I think a lot of our success has been as a result of the great leadership that she's brought forward to CCIB. But I think, again, what we need to do, and as Indigenous people, quite often, we don't want to brag about ourselves. It's hard for us to promote and brag. And I think we at CCIB need to be doing that. We need to showcase, because again, when you see the success and when you see the growth and what Indigenous businesses have done, people, it's a little bit frustrating sometimes to say, oh, I worked with an Indigenous business and I did that. Well, why do you think we can't do that? But unfortunately, that is sort of the perception. Again, so much media, and whenever Indigenous are involved, it's negative, just like with an Indigenous procurement. A lot of these things where people have taken advantage of it are showcasing. That gets the bites. That's what people look at. I think we should always be celebrating. We do that through our award systems at CCIB. I've had some of the great friends. I mean, Chief Bernard was talking about John Bernard. I was working with John in the 1990s. And I mean, he's been one of our Indigenous leaders. He's actually won a Lifetime Achievement Award through CCIB for entrepreneurship. And again, I think it's so uplifting for our young people to see someone that looks like them succeeding, going in, having a nice car, having a nice house, and sharing, giving them opportunities. So anytime, we should focus a lot more on success as opposed to failure. And I think Indigenous procurement is a means of success. As I said, like even when you look at the Boucher Group, it's a privately held company. They gave $1 million away to charities this year. They employ 40% Indigenous people from 80 communities around the country. We can take care of ourselves. You know, if all of a sudden you decide to drop this, well, bad on you, but we are still going to succeed. As Indigenous people, we've been knocked down and opportunities taken away from us for so often, but we are resilient and we're going to keep going. And I think we do need to showcase our success. There's incredible businesses. I am so proud. I think I'm one of the luckiest people. I go travel across the country working with Indigenous businesses. We have roundtables talking about this and the innovation. I mean, if you look at the defense sector, there are so many new, upcoming, innovative that provides so many great things. We are hosting an Indigenous procurement event in Edmonton on October 16th. We have 4 certified Indigenous businesses that are going to be showcasing the innovation they bring. Some of the stuff they bring is actually going to help corporate Canada. They can sell some carbon capture points. I don't know what all that is, but again, the innovation that Indigenous businesses are bringing is incredible. We're going to showcase that. We're going to showcase also our Aboriginal procurement champions that are doing a lot to help Indigenous businesses. We're also going to be talking about government procurement. So again, we'd welcome anyone to join, and it's going to be a great event. We just need to promote and showcase that we are successful, and there's a lot to be proud of.
And I would love to have a conversation with you about how we can, including ourselves here, the media, spotlight those tremendous uplifting positive stories about tremendous Indigenous businesses and success stories. Would love to work with you on that. But I understand the work of this committee wanting to strengthen the program. And I just wanted to quote the minister here, Minister Haidu, who stated, quote, "We're working with Indigenous partners to think through a better way, perhaps even at some point turning over maintenance of the list to Indigenous partners." So I just wanted to get on the record. We are working with First Nations, Métis, Inuit, with our Indigenous partners to make sure that we are improving this program so that it serves our entire Canadian community and Indigenous partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kusmirchuk, and Mr. Ducharme. Thank you for choosing the great city of Edmonton to showcase its successes. Mrs. Vignola, please go ahead.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Ducharme, I agree with you. We also need to showcase the successes, what's going well. Now, looking at what's not going as well, it's really to try to improve things. That's my point of view. Sorry for the interpreters, but I'm a positive complainer. So I'm trying to find what doesn't work in order to try to solve those problems, to have something constructive happen. Now, one of the problems, among the problems that your members are faced with, I mean, stop me if I'm wrong, but I think one of the problems is kind of caused by the Indian Act. I have trouble with that name. I don't like it. I don't like saying it. So that means that somebody who wants to get a loan but lives on reserve will have all the difficulty in the world getting that loan because they have no way to guarantee it. Am I wrong in saying that it's a burden, it's an obstacle, a significant one for Indigenous entrepreneurship?
It is a very significant one. And again, I think that's where sometimes joint ventures have had to come into play because the Indigenous business or the Indigenous community was not able to get the bid bonding, was not able to get the insurance, and they would have to get that through their joint venture partner. But again, it is a real struggle for Indigenous businesses. I have a great friend who's got a business, but she's actually had to store her equipment off reserve to be able to get financing to be able to access that, to be able to purchase that equipment. So it is something, again, the Indian Act, of full disclosure, I'm not completely familiar with the Indian Act. I really work on procurement. A lot of these things are sort of different with it. Yeah, that act has been a challenge for our Indigenous businesses. And I think, again, when we talk about the challenges, we do want to hear the challenges, and we have been fortunate. I mean, we have lobbied a lot with the federal government for certain changes, and there have been changes made. Indigenous businesses have always been held to a higher standard than any other group. When you look at social procurement or supplier diversity, we had more regulations and rules on us placed to be able to identify as an Indigenous business than other groups are. So we want to look at those challenges, removing the 33% employment requirement. And again, Chief Bernard, her brother, John Bernard, was one of the biggest advocates of that because within that growth of his business, he was not able to maintain 33% workforce in the technology field, which is very specialized. And I think by removing that barrier, it helps our Indigenous businesses. So it is good to find out about the barriers and the challenges. But again, successes needs to be highlighted as well.
Merci beaucoup. César.
Thank you very much.
Brad, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Ducharme, in a previous response in speaking about your organization's directory of Indigenous businesses, you compared the federal government's approach to their directory, which is solely about proving indigeneity, to your organization's more comprehensive approach, which includes not only Indigenous identity, but also other factors. Is this a fair characterization?
Well, I think if you go on the Indigenous Business Directory, I think to be included on the Indigenous Business Directory, it does ask that you have to supply more than just proof of indigeneity. You do have to supply the documentation to prove the ownership and control meets the 51% criteria for to be classified as an Indigenous business. Maybe you just attest to that without actually providing the documentation. I don't know. I don't do the certification for the federal government. But we do.
Okay, but
require
my
that
question
documentation.
was just about the distinction or the difference between your organization's directory and Indigenous Services Canada's list. Whether it sounded like your organization was utilizing a more comprehensive approach to certifying Indigenous business than that of the federal government. Perhaps I'm wrong. That was my impression just based on previous remarks.
Well, I think if you actually went into the Indigenous Business Directory and look at the requirement for being included, I think that documentation is required. It's not just to say you're Indigenous, because you still have to prove that there's an actual business, that you're the owner of that business. So there is documentation. And that's what we require as well, to have the 51% ownership and control be held by the Indigenous individual or individuals.
If I may, to both of our witnesses, we have the ability to make recommendations to the federal government to improve this Indigenous procurement process and program. If you could make one recommendation to the government that would improve the current approach, what would it be? And maybe starting with Mr. Ducharme, and then we'll go to Chief Bernard.
Just brief, because we're almost out of time.
Again, I think the one recommendation is to work with Indigenous peoples and the businesses and give them the opportunities and see what the challenges are from Indigenous businesses to be able to do it. I mean, you have to simplify the process as well, I think, for the federal government with their contracting requirements.
Since the first meeting in December of 2023, the FNPO, which is the First Nations Procurement Organization, has formed a steering committee of 6 Indigenous organizations, including AFN. I'm looking to secure some funding to ensure the work that is being done there alongside with the Canadian government to be part of this, so that they can get full-blown information right from the organizations on how to make this a better process. I do want to, can I say one thing? Being Aboriginal, it's not a skill, but yet an Aboriginal procurement with joint ventures, it's almost like that. If you're Aboriginal, then all of a sudden that's a qualification for bringing to a joint venture. And we don't agree with this. Obviously, you have to start somewhere. That should be small, but we believe that the Aboriginal side of the joint venture should progress, and it doesn't seem to be doing that. We do joint ventures, but there's no initiative for the First Nation portion of that joint venture to grow. So there's some work to be done there, as well as everything else that was discussed today. So I'm really looking to see if we can get the secured funding to move forward and work with the Canadian government on this strategy. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, can you get that acronym again? What does that mean, the FNPO? Okay, I know she really talked about the 5 organizations that are working.
Yes, the 6 organizations, Indigenous organizations, including AFN. It's the First Nations Procurement Organization. That our very first meeting was December 2023, where we've all come together looking for ways to strengthen the strategy and so we can all be satisfied with moving forward. And if there's a need for changes, let's look at that and work together. I just can't stand the fact that the government does this. They go behind closed doors. They think they know how the best way to serve us when we're not even at the table. That's got to stop. And I've said this to the Prime Minister himself when I was national chief. And it's not only on this issue, it's on everything across the board. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We'll go to Mrs. Block, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you again for your testimony. As my colleague mentioned, this is part of a much bigger study on a broken procurement system under this Liberal government. And one of the issues that we have found in procurement across government is the use of middlemen, companies which subcontract all of the work, doing none of it themselves, but taking a 15 to 30% cut of any project. And I guess my question to both of you would be, do you support the Auditor General launching an audit into fraud in Indigenous procurement?
I do.
Yes, again, if there's just cause for them to investigate, I think it's very relevant, and I think that would probably dissuade others, and if there's repercussions for it.
Thank you very much. I will now turn the rest of my time over to Ms. Kusi.
Thank you very much. In my previous line of questioning, I was talking about the subcontracting, but I'm also interested in the business structure, which is most beneficial. In your opinion, Mr. Ducharme, should the government seek Indigenous involvement throughout the business structure and not just the ownership to ensure that it is truly Indigenous people that receive the benefits of the set-aside?
Are you talking employees within the organization, or when you say the structure, I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Yeah, that's correct. Yes. There has been a focus on the ownership as opposed to the employees. And in my opinion, this would be a benefit of doing an overview of the subcontracting process and the structure within the process. But just to get your opinion as well, do you think that the government should seek Indigenous involvement throughout the business structure and not just the ownership itself?
Well, again, I think then we're going to be held to different standards than other people. I think as Indigenous people, we in turn are going to hire our own people, and our stats do show that that's what's happening. Indigenous businesses hire Indigenous people, but a woman-owned business or a minority-owned business does not have that requirement. That was a requirement that was always done. I feel that as Indigenous people, we're always held to a higher standard than other groups within Canada, and I find that it's almost offensive and racist in ways that we have to prove more. We have to be different than any other group, that more is expected of us and more burden on us to be able to succeed and grow our businesses.
In regards to that question, if I may,
Yes, please
it
do.
was mentioned that the First Nations, the organizations or the businesses, Indigenous entrepreneurs and businesses have to hire so many Indigenous people. That could be to the demise of any organization or business. John Bernard from Donnacona had an issue with this back in 2006 when he spoke to the Standing Committee. The problem lies with that is if there's no qualified people to do that work, or Indigenous people, then we are cut off. And that is to the demise. And no Indigenous company or non-Native company would hire people for the sake of just hiring them because they're Indigenous or not. It could be to the demise of that company. So insisting a percentage of Indigenous people being hired, I don't think that should be really implemented in here. We always try our best as Indigenous companies to hire Indigenous people, but if we can't, then we are cut off from the bidding process, and that's just not correct. So there's definitely more work to be talked about, to be done there. So I do agree with the other speaker that it needs, or the other witness, that it shouldn't be an issue, but the ownership at 51 plus should definitely be, and to prove that they are the owner and they are getting those benefits. It's important.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Sousa, please.
Thank you. Chief Bernard, thank you for your testimony, Mr. Ducharme. Chief Bernard, you mentioned earlier that 5%, that if the Métis Nation or members of the Métis community were to receive up to 5% of the contracts, then there would be no room left for the AFN. Now, is that correct, or is this not that's a floor? It's not a ceiling, right? There's opportunity to continue on with contracts with those that are identified. Is that not correct?
Absolutely, that is true. But if you look around the table, you can probably look at everybody around that table right now, say that they have Aboriginal ancestry. They may even
Sorry,
have
I'm going to
Métis card.
interrupt. Sorry, I'm going to interrupt. Can you move your mic back down?
I can't hear you.
Or up? Just. We can't hear you at all right now.
Well,
Can you hear me now?
Perfect. Once you start
Okay.
again, please.
Yes. So I do want, if you don't mind, if there could be a repeat of that question, I'm sorry. I just.
yes, certainly. You mentioned earlier that should the Métis community receive up to 5% of the contracts, then there would be nothing left for other identified Indigenous communities. Is that correct? Or is that not a floor as opposed to a ceiling?
Well, as you know, it is the floor. The minimum is 5%. So hopefully that we can get above that, and that's not the concern I have. The concern is the three national organizations, Inuit, Métis, and First Nations. The population is different. So in taking 5% and dividing it among three nations that could access some of these.
So let me correct that. I
contracts.
mean, you again are suggesting that if those other two communities got 5%, there would be nothing left. That's incorrect. Is that not so? There's more that can be had for more if there's more
Well,
opportunities.
there's more that can be had. Absolutely, more can be had because, as you mentioned, it is not the ceiling. It is the floor for that 5%. We're hoping to go above that eventually, and hopefully on a yearly basis we get up to that 10% if potentially possible. But my concern is if the government sees that they're at that 5% and you have one or two businesses that make up for that whole 5%, then there's no obligation on the government's part to look at all the other smaller First Nations entrepreneurs who may be looking for.
Thank you. Mr. Descharmes, do you share that concern?
Again, I think it's the reporting. What I am concerned about is if there is a $500 million contract that's a joint venture. I mean, that's taken up a lot of spend. The 5% again is a floor, and I think it can go over to that. It's not 5% that is divided between the three groups. It's Indigenous, and again, we can exceed that 5% between all three groups.
The government and the ministry is undergoing a review of this very issue, and the very issue of identifying who's Indigenous and who is not, and determining through consultations with other groups how to proceed in an effective manner. Has your organization been contacted by the government on this issue, Mrs. Sharp?
We work a lot with the government on Indigenous procurement, and I think even the AFN, there's been a few different committees that we've sat on that we've talked about Indigenous procurement.
Chief Bernard, has your organization been contacted by government in trying to determine the best way forward on this issue?
No, this issue in reference to membership of the organization has been an issue from the beginning, and it's something that I haven't seen government take this seriously. As you know, everybody can have a descendant, up to 10 generations. That makes them Métis. It's just not fair when our organization under First Nations are all under the federal government, where they tell us we're cut off after second. So where this is just, it's more work than ever, and it's not something new. So it definitely needs to be looked at.
Chief Bernard, I'm talking about the status of the Indigenous Business Directory. Have there been consultations with the organization to determine how best to proceed?
Not that I'm aware of.
So the review that's being underway now with other stakeholder groups, you have not been, not you specifically, but your organization has not been.
I'm assuming they have. If you're telling me that government is already undertaking this, then they must have reached out to AFN.
Mr. Deschamps, we have differences of opinion, obviously, here between various organizations to determine who's Indigenous and who's not. You've already identified that you and your directory that you've established alongside your business directory for those that are Indigenous. How well received are they in the community in terms of the private sector in determining those contracts?
Well, I think any of our Indigenous businesses are recognized by the private sector, and they are well received within procurement opportunities.
And what is your do you have consultations with AFN and the Inuit community as well in these determinations?
There are a lot of different consultation groups, and the AFN does sit on committees that we sit on when we talk about federal procurement and advancing the 5%. There is the Indigenous Procurement Working Group, which is made up of ITK, the MNC, the AFN, other national Indigenous economic organizations as well.
And so when we talk about bigger contracts and the partnerships with those that may not be Indigenous, especially with the subcontracting, is there not an over requirement to have about, I believe it's 33% overall in terms of Indigenous?
So I think the
Answer, 'cause that's our
33%.
time.
Oh, thank you.
Answer quickly.
Probably not.
Thanks, Mr. Sousa. Mr. Genuis, please.
Thank you, Chair. As this is our final round, I just want to underline our view that Indigenous peoples in Canada have struggled heroically against incredible odds, and so many Indigenous entrepreneurs are doing incredible work, supporting themselves, their families, and uplifting their communities. I can say from an Alberta perspective, we've seen this particularly in the oil and gas sector, and how many Indigenous peoples, businesses, entrepreneurs, communities are part of and benefiting from the development of our energy resources. But it stretches across all sectors, of course. Meanwhile, the federal government in the last 9 years has broken the procurement system. So we are here celebrating Indigenous successes and also holding the federal government accountable for failures of engagement, of consultation, of responsiveness, of verification that we've talked about and that we've heard about from the witnesses. I have one question for each of you. Mr. Ducharme, one of the things I see in the procurement system in general is a favoritism for insiders, for incumbent players. And the procurement ombudsman has written about this, for instance, in the context of ArriveCam, where you have a whole bunch of criteria put in place that say you must have a certain number of existing contracts or existing work with the federal government. Now, an obvious effect of that, it seems to me, is that it excludes new businesses and people from historically disadvantaged backgrounds who are starting businesses, don't have perhaps the same kind of institutional history, are excluded by those kinds of rules. So you have, on the one hand, policies that are supposed to promote Indigenous procurement, but you have other policies which, in effect, make it more difficult for especially newer Indigenous businesses, as well as probably other minority-owned businesses, to access those opportunities. So would one way of improving the system also be to simply remove a lot of these kind of insider preferences that exist in the system, so that new entrants have an easier time bidding on federal government opportunities?
Of course. I mean, I think making it easier for Indigenous businesses, having that previous work experience has been one of the biggest struggles. I mean, if the government wanted to include Indigenous businesses and they didn't have it, and they require them to have previous experience with the government, well, they're not going to get those. So that is one area that we've been lobbying and advocating for as well, like even with joint ventures. Right now, the non-Indigenous partner can provide all three references. We would like to see maybe the Indigenous partner have a smaller reference requirement, but then to ensure that it's making it easier. And again, there is a lot of people that want to keep using their same incumbent, but we have to look at to make sure that every opportunity should be reviewed to see if there is Indigenous capacity and invite Indigenous businesses to
So
that.
just to probe that a bit, actually, it sounds like what you're saying is that the combination of these Indigenous procurement policies, but also with kind of the preference for insiders, is pushing Indigenous businesses towards joint ventures, perhaps in cases where the Indigenous companies might be able to do the work themselves if there was a lower requirement on references. Is that true? I don't mean to put words in your mouth. I'm just trying to
I guess in a way it could be, but again, also lowering the requirements, because again, the bid bonding, like some of these requirements with the bid bonding and the insurance,
Right.
makes it impossible for our Indigenous businesses, and for them to be able to do it, they do need to have partners.
Right. Yeah. But the key thing should be whether or not the company can do the work. Right.
Yes.
And to Chief Bernard, my expectation would be that the end objective of this policy is to improve economic opportunity for Indigenous communities and for Indigenous peoples in general across the country to be able to benefit. The means for getting to that objective, of course, is to support Indigenous entrepreneurs, but with the ultimate goal of general uplift for Indigenous peoples and to move towards substantive economic equality of opportunity. But Minister Haidu and David Yeo in his comments as well have essentially said it's just about the individual. It's about verification of the individual and the individual benefiting. As we've talked about, they haven't even done a very good job of providing that verification. But if this policy is working right, would we expect there to be a general uplift of Indigenous communities? And how can we track to ensure that this policy leads to that general uplift?
Thank you for the question. Well, right now, yes, I feel that there should be an uplifting here of the communities through the the community members who are the entrepreneurs. Now, if you're Métis, you may not be associated with the First Nation, so there's no potential there, depending on where you live, because a lot of the Métis are not associated with First Nations, so they're not associated with those communities. They just happen to be descendants. So there lies the issue there. But definitely, if the entrepreneur is from a First Nation, there should be some uplifting of the community as well as the entrepreneur eventually. And so the validation of that database on how many Indigenous communities there are in Canada, we are easy for us to, for the AFN, because we are associated with First Nations and our membership list is in Ottawa, that they approved. Whereas if you're looking for the status of a Métis, they were just walked into the office and said they were Métis and showed something that they were 10th generation, and they became Métis, and they are now considered Aboriginal businesses. And that's where I have the problem.
Perfect. I have to cut you off there because we're out of time, Chief Bernard. We're going to go to Mr. Batiste, and then we'll finish with Mrs. Vignola and Mr. Backrack. Go ahead, please, sir.
Thank you. And Regional Chief, just, I think that you have done a great job of showing the complexity and the general inequalities that are out there when we look at trying to determine who is Indigenous. And this committee is tasked with trying to figure out how do we improve Indigenous procurement. But at the end of the day, it falls back on who is applying. The Conservatives believe that this is a simple process where we should have a simple solution. But across Canada, whether it's academia, whether it's business, whether it's the music industry, there are those who've benefited unfairly because of the question of who is Indigenous and who is determining who is Indigenous. You mentioned that you have a committee, FNPO, that is looking at this. Do you have best practices or a working document that you'd be able to share with this committee on what your views are on how to determine indigeneity in a fair way? And go further to that, if you don't, do you know of anyone across this country who's done this in a way that's helpful for government to figure out this question of how do we, as a primarily non-Indigenous entity, determine for Indigenous people who and who isn't part of them?
Well, I believe the First Nation procurement organization, the FNPO that I mentioned, is just started. So there may be something that was discussed within the last 6 months since the initial meeting. And if there is, I definitely can get it to you. I don't see that as a problem. But definitely the support of this organization with the other 6 Indigenous organizations is important. So I just really want to put that out to the committee members, to the Senate Standing Committees here. So it's essential to get the work done, and you need, I mean, in order to get it done fast enough and cheap, less costly, is to involve us. So definitely moving forward, we should be able to get something from the FNPO as long as we have the funding to continue. But I'm not sure where that lies. But definitely, this is a request from the AFN to establish some funds to be able to move forward and let us do the work with you. Thank you.
So, Regional Chief, just in terms of following up on that, I'm glad to hear that there's an organization tasked working collaboratively with different levels of organizations to address this topic. Can you tell us more about the FNPO? And if you're someone sitting in a reserve in Eskasoni in my community, and you say, who is this organization and why did we give them the mandate to determine who's Indigenous for the rest of us? How do we have confidence that this organization has the mandate to do such things?
Well, I don't know at this point in time. I was not part of that very first meeting in December 2023. And so it's just initially starting. And the players around the table, I don't have that list or anything at this point, but in moving forward, definitely this organization should be the one working with the government to to ensure that we are looking and ensuring that it is Indigenous entrepreneurs that are participating.
Take it from the chair that this organization that's doing this ongoing work would be given the opportunity to submit a document that might help improve the study? Okay. Is there any
I also have
final comments that either of you have on how we can improve this process? Joanne, I heard a good bit from you, but I wanted to give Mr. Ducharme a chance to weigh in and final thoughts.
Well, I think at CCIB,
you
we
move
are
forward-
ready and we have our feet on the ground doing all of this work already. I think a lot of the things, when you look at this, we're talking Indigenous business. There's almost two different sidelines here. You're determining who's Indigenous, and then you're also in turn determining what an Indigenous business is. I think the indigeneity is something that even within the FNPO, my understanding is, again, each one of the First Nations would still have to determine who their membership is. And I don't know if the FNPO as a whole would be respected across the country. I mean, we have 630 some First Nations that have their own rules and regulations and who they have on their membership, and even some of the stuff that Chief Bernard mentioned today about who they keep on as members, even though if the government, and again, a lot of that with the government, I think, is a result of funding and costs associated with it.
Thank you very much. Mrs. McNulty, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Ducharme, earlier you mentioned, and I quite agree with you, that if we required that Indigenous businesses to have a certain number of Indigenous employees, but that we're not requiring the same thing of, for example, women-owned businesses or for those of visible minorities, that's a racism. That's a way of adding difficulty for Indigenous businesses. Now, I want to come back, take a few steps back. You were saying if within the community, people are not available with the correct training, it's, of course, you're going to go look elsewhere outside the community. Is there anything that gets in the way of access to training within some of the communities? And how could we fix that?
This is dealing a little bit with employment, which is sort of outside of my everyday realm of work. But I think funding is an area that there's not enough funding out there for Indigenous people to get to these different programs. I think, again, if you looked at the educational groups to say how much funding is out there for Indigenous business, that could be an area where they're struggling. But again, our Indigenous businesses are looking, and even non-Indigenous businesses are always looking for Indigenous within certain sectors. I mean, within the engineering field, there's very limited number. Architects, I believe there's only 17 certified Indigenous architects in Canada. That was a couple of years ago. So there are areas. Again, as Indigenous businesses, as I mentioned earlier, some of them are bringing in, they're training these people, getting them their certificates, hoping they stay on. But again, they're still celebrating if they move on to other areas. So I think working together with the ISIT holders to bring the opportunities and actually do stuff where there is opportunities and not just go to school to go to school. If there is actually trades in different areas that there is a real lack of Indigenous employees would be beneficial.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup.
Thanks. I don't think I answered the question, but maybe I do. Never mind.
Thanks. We'll go to Mr. Backrack, and then I just need about 30 seconds just for some housekeeping. Mr. Backrack, go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks again to both of our witnesses for their part in this important conversation. Indigenous Services Canada does have a procedure in place for pre-award compliance audits, and I'm curious, Mr. Ducharme, whether any of the businesses that are members of your organization have been subject to such pre-award compliance audits, and if so, what their experience of that audit process has been.
In the past, we have had a couple of businesses that have been audited, and they did say it was a very thorough process that they went through. Again, there used to be a trigger, I think, on a value of contracts that they said there would be audits, but I don't know if that's ever been completely followed through on.
Yeah, I believe the trigger is value of $2 billion. Those audits are required, and there's some discretion to perform audits in other cases as well. I guess the question is whether you feel that audit process is sufficiently robust to ensure the integrity of the overall process, or whether there are improvements needed when it comes to audits.
Well, I think that audit process should have almost done it the original part to be able to allow them to actually be included in the directory to ensure that they meet their criteria.
So more comprehensive and applied in more cases prior to even being considered, as opposed to right before a contract award.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And Chief Bernard, do you share that view?
Yes, I do. And I think that I do want to just note before I know he's closing in 2 seconds, we have Resolution 73, 2023. That was passed at the AFN last year at the General Assembly that I would like to submit if I'm allowed to. And also I have the document on the Standing Committee from 2006 that the Standing Committee, this was in reference to the procurement strategy. And if the people around the table who are making these decisions have received this document, and if not, am I able to submit it?
Chief Bernard, I'm sure the committee would appreciate you tabling both of those documents for our review as part of this study. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll hand the floor back to you.
Mr. Backrack, yes, I'll get you in a second, Mr. Genuis. Mr. Ducharme and Chief Bernard, thank you very much for joining us. You've both been wonderful witnesses. We've gone through the study partially in 2018, and I'm still learning some more on the issue, and you've brought some very important things forward for us to work on. I hope we'll see you back at OGO one day in the future where we're celebrating fixing this system. But thank you very much. I have about 30 seconds I need to do for housekeeping. You're welcome to sit in on this OGO business, or you can excuse yourselves. But thank you again for joining us. Colleagues, real quick, October 1, September 30th, we're not here. October 1, we're kicking off the environment audit. My intent is to invite the Deputy Minister and the CFO to start off, and then just ask you to provide witnesses by tomorrow for the other two meetings. So if you do that by 3 p.m. tomorrow. Canada Post study has gone out. So I'll get back to you. Canada Post study has gone out. If you could have recommendations to us within 1 week, 7 days, please. Translated would be preferred. On Canada Post, Mrs. Vignola had a motion regarding official languages. TBS has requested to join along. We're not part of the witness list, so I'm just seeking UC to have TBS join official languages in Canada Post at that meeting. We're fine with that? Wonderful. On the issue of, just on the environment thing, and then Mr. Genuis, sir.
Just for my memory, can you refresh my memory around the environment and
This was on the grants and contribution audit that came out, I think last week or the week before.
Okay, that's
so we
what
passed a meeting
here.
for 3 meetings.
Yeah.
So I figured we'll just start off with the DM and the CFO.
Okay, and you
then
want
fill the
witnesses
other
for
2
that by the end of
tomorrow.
By end of day tomorrow.
We figured tomorrow because it's limited, because it's just within environment.
Yeah, is it possible just because I got to catch up on it? Can it be Thursday noon?
Sure.
Okay.
Is that fine, everyone? Thursday noon for witnesses?
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, sir. And then Mr. Genuis, please, and then Mrs. Kusi. And we'll wrap up quickly.
Sure. Just on the Indigenous procurement study, something Mr. Batiste said made me think of it. We can receive documents from witnesses or civil society groups who don't have the opportunity to come as witnesses. As part of studies I've been part of in the past, there's been sort of an open portal for submitting written briefs. And I think it'd be worthwhile for this study in particular to invite written briefs. There's over 600 Indigenous nations in Canada. They won't all be able to testify, of course. I wanted them all to be able to testify, but given the limit of meetings proposed. So I wonder if I assume it would be agreeable to just have that portal available and to invite written briefs and incorporate that as part of our deliberations on this.
Yeah, I assume as always, we receive solicited and unsolicited briefs through the clerk or through the OGO webs or email address, and then they're just forwarded after translation if they're relevant. So if that's fine with everyone.
Okay.
Then
Great.
Mrs. Kusi, and then we'll adjourn.
Thank you, Chair. I was just looking for the status on the invitation to Minister Jolie regarding the Global Affairs Canada property portfolio.
Oh, yes. We had invited, we had 2 witnesses invited, Miss Nicholson, and I think she's agreed in 2 weeks' time. I can't recall the exact date, October 3rd. Minister Jolie was not available on our regular sitting times for OGO. We advised the clerk to go back and ask for alternate dates around the OGO time that, if necessary, we'll add in an OGO meeting. We have not heard back. We communicated this again yesterday, and we have not heard anything back, but I'm hoping we can find a date, but we haven't heard back from Global Affairs.
Thank you.
Just briefly, Mr. Genos.
Yeah, just to reiterate, I mean, the committee voted to ask Minister Jolie to come. We can, I suspect, be available at any time. I know she's been in Ottawa. She's been in the House. She's here. She's in town. So we have important questions to ask, and it would be a big surprise to me if a minister who's been invited by committee, who's in Ottawa and available would, and when we're extending the maximum flexibility, I sure hope she appears before Thanksgiving as we've proposed.
I assure you, your humble chair and your humble clerk are on it, and we've extended all available considerations to Global Affairs. With that, colleagues, thank you very much for today. Wonderful questions. We are adjourned. Call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 140 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates. As always, colleagues, remind everyone again, just keep headphones away from your mic so we can protect the hearing of our very valued interpreters. We have two witnesses today. We have Chief Bernard, thanks for joining us. We'll open the floor to you for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Then we'll go to Mr. Ducharme. But Chief Bernard, the floor is yours. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, and I do apologize for the inconvenience. I'm not very technical savvy here. Greetings. I am Joanna Bernard, the Assembly of First Nation Regional Chief for New Brunswick. The Assembly of First Nations is a national organization representing First Nations and their elected chiefs across Canada. The AFN's mandate is received from First Nations rights holders through resolutions. It is important to have a clear understanding of who right holders are for work related to policies, frameworks, and strategies. I welcome the opportunity to speak to you on the topic of Indigenous procurement. I must note that First Nations require direct consultation on this matter. Procurement policies at all levels of government need to be inclusive to reflect diversity and equality. The distinct-based approach is required to transform the Indigenous procurement landscape. The federal government needs to fulfill its duty to consult and accommodate First Nations on procurement issues, to effectively review and advance policies. This will help eliminate wasteful and corrupt procurement procedures. Equitable procurement policies have an important role in supporting First Nations economic development and meaningful reconciliation. Procurement policies at all levels of government must be inclusive and distinctions-based, moving away from one-size-fits-all approach. The federal government's 5% target is reflected in the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples Action Plan, which we uphold. However, the 5% is the minimal target. The population of Canada is estimated to be 5% First Nations people. If the government is to close the gap with First Nations and lift communities out of poverty, procurement contracts need to reflect an increase beyond the minimal target. The 5% minimal only maintains the current economic status. When First Nations businesses have the capacity and support to participate in bidding and winning contracts, economic prosperity can be reinvested into communities and help them thrive. In October 2019, the AFN prepared an evergreen report on updates and revisions needed to better support access by First Nations businesses and procurement in Canada and focus on the federal procurement portfolio. The Government of Canada, the Government of Canada in 2016 awarded over 340 contracts for goods and services and construction valued at over $18 billion. However, targeted Indigenous procurements under the procurement strategy for Aboriginal business, as it was known then, only total 93.5 million in 2015, representing less than 1% of all federal procurements. Today, the federal government spends approximately 22 billion every year procuring goods and services from businesses across Canada. Still less than 1% of that goes towards Indigenous businesses. Procurement policies must also eliminate the risk of fraudulent players looking for financial gains to protect First Nations' best interests. In 2022 and 2023, the federal government released a report on its progress towards the 5% minimum target. The AFN had concerns with the lack of transparency on business definitions and eligible criteria for the types of business who would qualify as Indigenous. Transparency must be prioritized to maintain trust and uphold legitimate Indigenous businesses. Fair, transparent, and open access to procurement opportunities from the Government of Canada, provincial governments, and private sector is the key priority for First Nations and critical to the economic growth, self-determination, and community well-being. The AFN has been working with partner organizations to establish a First Nations procurement organization known as the FFPO from the rest of my speech, which aims to help First Nations peoples and businesses overcome systemic barriers in accessing federal procurement opportunities. Since the first meeting in December 2023, the FNPO has formed a steering committee, of 6 Indigenous organizations, including the AFN. The AFN has also been supporting the development of Indigenous business definitions led by the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association. It was launched in March 2024 and provides a set of criteria that determines what constitutes an Indigenous business or organizations for the purpose of procurement. An Indigenous business is identified as a business where an Indigenous person has sole responsibilities for making decisions, receives all profits, claims all losses, assumes all risks, and pays personal income tax for the Indigenous sole proprietor, and is 100% owned by Indigenous peoples. Cooperation, partnership, nonprofit, and non-for-profit corporations, charitable organizations, and joint venture definitions will include at least 51% of the business structure is owned or controlled by Indigenous people. There is currently no consistent